If you walk out to Conemaugh River Lake on a hot, dry summer day, when the water pulls back farther than usual, you might spot something strange sticking out of the mud. Most people would glance at it and think it's just some old broken concrete. But if you stop and really look at it, you'll notice it's too square, too straight, too solid to be a random chunk of rock. It used to be part of a foundation. And not just any foundation, it once held up a bridge that led straight into a small American town. A town that isn't here anymore. Sometimes a hiker will stand there for a long time, the heat rolling across the empty valley, the air so still it almost feels like it's holding its breath. They'll stare at that rough block of stone and wonder what it used to connect to. And then the same question comes, soft at first, then heavier the longer you stand there. What happened here? It's a fair question, because once, not centuries ago, not in some lost civilization, but right here in modern American history, there was a real town where that water now spreads out. It had little roads, wooden houses, families who knew each other by name, and children who raced their bikes down dusty streets. There were trains that rattled through, farms that fed the valley, and a quiet sort of pride that comes from building a life in a place that feels steady. People were born in Livermore. People worked there. People loved there. And then, one day, the town was gone. Not slowly. Not because people decided to leave. Not because the land dried up or industry moved on. Livermore was erased. And the part that surprises most people is the reason. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers didn't destroy the town because of a battle. They didn't do it to hide a scandal. They didn't do it out of anger or mistake. They did it for one simple word that sounds calm and harmless. Safety. That word carried enough weight to wipe an entire community off the map. And here's the part that sticks with you, long after you walk away from that lake bed. Livermore wasn't just torn down. It slipped out of memory. Almost no one talks about it. Its name doesn't come up in school lessons or documentaries. It isn't a famous ghost town. People didn't keep the story alive. They just moved on. A real town was swallowed by water and silence. You might hear stories about deserted mining towns out west, or old villages taken over by shifting rivers. But Livermore didn't empty out on its own. It didn't fade because time got to it. It disappeared because someone, somewhere, looked at a map and decided the town had to die so other towns downstream could live. And when the bulldozers finished, and the dam held back the river, the water rose slow and steady, covering every street and doorstep. Life went on. The world looked away. And Livermore slipped under. That's the part that feels heavy when you stand where the town used to be. You look at the water and think about what's underneath living rooms, porches, kitchen tables, quiet streets, the memories of people who never thought their home would be erased. You wonder how a whole community can vanish and leave behind almost nothing but a few broken pieces of stone and a name that most people have never heard. And then the real question settles in. How does a country forget a town that once stood right here? Because Livermore wasn't a tiny speck of a place. It had its own rhythms, its own families, its own stories. And yet when the decision was made, the story ended without noise. Old newspapers mention flood control. Official documents talk about relocation. But there are hardly any stories about the families packing their last box, or the final church service, or the day the doors closed for good. There's almost nothing about how it felt to lose a place you thought would be yours forever. And that's why this story matters. Because a real American town disappeared, and the silence around it is almost as deep as the water that covers it. Somewhere out there, a few broken foundations still poke out when the lake shrinks. They stand there like small reminders, trying to say, "We were here." They remind us that the people of Livermore lived real lives, had real joys, real problems, real hopes, and all of that deserves to be remembered. This isn't a story told for drama. It isn't told to blame. It's told so that Livermore doesn't vanish twice, once in the water, and again in our memory. If preserving real American stories matters to you, consider subscribing. Stories like this disappear when no one remembers them. To understand why Livermore mattered, we have to go back to the people who once called it home. To really see what was lost, Imagine stepping into the valley of the Conemaugh River in southeastern Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the river flows quietly now, but back then it was part of a working landscape, a place where people built lives. The town of Livermore, Pennsylvania, was founded along the river and the canal system. It began as a small stop on the old Pennsylvania Canal, Western Division, and later the railroads followed the same corridor. The land around was farmed. Families lived in modest homes, and a tight-knit community formed shops, a schoolhouse, church, rail station. Life there was ordinary, predictable, and grounded in daily work. Every morning, men walked from their homes to the rail line or the canal towpath. They fixed tracks, loaded goods, tended fields. Women rose early, baked bread, washed clothes by hand, hung them in the breeze, cooked dinner before dusk. The children went to the little school in town. They learned their letters and numbers, sometimes helped at home, sometimes joined in the riverbank games in the summer. The town had a school that served dozens of students, and a church congregation that also served as community center. In the evenings, families gathered. After dinner, you might see neighbors walking across to talk about the day. Someone might bring news from the rail depot. Someone else might mention the crop prospects. Children might play tag under gas lamps or lanterns. The values of this community were simple but strong. Work hard, look after your neighbor, take care of your home, raise your children well. In Livermore, if your neighbor's barn needed repairs, someone would help. If a friend lost a family member, the whole town showed up at the funeral. The network of relationships was intimate, everyone knew everyone. And life was rooted in place, this valley, this river, this town. The physical setting added to the feeling of belonging. The river carried freight and connected to other towns. The rail line gave access. The canal path reminded older settlers of earlier generations. The hills rose around the valley. The water flowed past rocks and trees. In summer, the children walked to the riverbank, dipped their toes in cool water, maybe skipped stones. In winter, they watched the trains drift through, smoke puffing, carrying goods and people beyond Livermore to other places. Because Livermore had this stable rhythm, its fate feels all the more poignant. Many towns disappear slowly, business leaves, people move. But this town was not left entirely by choice. One moment it thrived. The next moment it faced forces beyond its everyday life. And when that force came, it was not a failed harvest or a mine closure, but a decision based on the river itself. There were signs the river could turn against the town. Folks knew the water could rise. They remembered big storms. But they also believed the town would survive because it always had. The canal and rail kept it alive. The farms fed families. The community held together. The river was a giver. So when you understand what daily life was like, stepping into the school, hearing the bells, smelling the bread fresh from the oven, seeing the trains roll by, you recognize Livermore as more than a location. You see real lives, hopes, routines. Those hopes included the next generation. Children growing up in that valley, dreaming simple dreams thanks to their parents' work. Maybe one kid hoped to work on the railroad. Maybe another hoped to become a teacher at the little school. The idea of staying, of belonging, of living a full life in Livermore seemed entirely possible. And because life was so steady, the thought that the very river itself, a part of their everyday life, could become the reason the town would vanish seems almost cruel. The river that gave the town its way in the world would one day be the reason it died. People in Livermore always respected the river. They understood it. They lived beside it. They listened to it. It had moods, just like any living thing. Most days it was calm and helpful. After storms, it got a little louder. But in the spring of 1936, it became something no one in the valley had ever seen before. It started with heavy rain. Not just a few hours of rain, but days of it. Rain so steady that the ground couldn't drink anymore. Rain that made the river rise inch by inch at first, then faster, and then so fast it frightened people who had lived there their whole lives. Folks in Livermore watched from porches and windows as the water pushed up against the banks, like a giant trying to climb out. Then snow began melting upstream. A lot of snow. And all that water came rushing toward the Conemaugh Valley at the same time the rain was falling. People later said it felt like the river suddenly doubled in size. By the time St. Patrick's Day arrived, the valley was already bracing for something bad. What came next was worse than anything they imagined. The river spilled over the banks with a roar. It swept across the low streets first, filling basements, then creeping into kitchens and living rooms. People grabbed what they could, clothes, photos, food, and tried to reach higher ground. The water kept rising. It moved fast and hard, breaking fences, shoving wagons, lifting small outbuildings right off the ground. Livermore was not the only town hit. Towns all along the Conemaugh and the Allegheny valleys faced the same danger. But something about Livermore's position in the valley made it especially exposed. Some families watched from the hillside as the water swallowed the lower part of town. They could only point and hope their homes would still be standing when the water left. Other families stayed behind to try and save what they could. People stood in waist-deep water, pushing against floating furniture and hoping the walls would hold. The river didn't care. It kept rising. Old photos from that time show Livermore underwater almost up to the rooftops. Houses stood like lonely islands in a wide brown sea. The road disappeared. The tracks disappeared. The town's shape was gone. When the water finally dropped, the valley looked bruised. Mud coated everything. Furniture was ruined. Walls were cracked. Rail lines were twisted. Chickens, cows, and stored grain were gone. People walked through what was left and tried not to cry. They were used to storms, but this one had broken something deeper than wood and brick. It broke the idea that Livermore was safe. Even after the cleanup began, something changed in the minds of people who made decisions far away from the valley. The St. Patrick's Day flood didn't just damage the town. It showed the government that the river system could threaten entire regions if nothing was done. Across Pennsylvania and beyond, leaders started asking hard questions. What if storms like this happened again? What if next time the damage was worse? What could be built to stop this from happening? In the months that followed, engineers, lawmakers, and officials studied the disaster. They looked at maps of the rivers. They measured rainfall. They measured flood levels. They reviewed the damage across all the towns, not just Livermore. And there was one idea that kept coming up. The region needed a system of flood control dams. This idea became law through the Flood Control Act of 1936. 2 years later, another act strengthened it. These laws gave the federal government the power to build dams, reservoirs, and flood protection projects across the country. And when the United States Army Corps of Engineers studied the Conemaugh Valley, they made a decision that would change Livermore forever. To protect the larger towns and cities downstream places with far more people and far more buildings, Livermore would be placed inside what the planners called a sacrificial zone. It meant the town sat in the exact spot where water could be held back safely behind a new dam. If the dam ever had to catch a major flood, Livermore's land would take the hit, not the larger communities farther down the river. On paper, the idea looked reasonable. A small town sacrifice to save many bigger ones. In numbers, it made sense. In human terms, it was heartbreaking. At first, people in Livermore did not understand what was coming. They heard talk about a dam, but assumed life would continue as usual. Maybe the water would rise a little sometimes, they thought. But surely the town would stay. It had always stayed. But the paperwork was clear. The government would take the land. Families would be paid for their homes. The town would eventually be removed. No rebuilding would be allowed, even after normal seasonal floods. The future dam and reservoir meant the town's fate was already sealed. One by one, signs of life began to fade. A few stores closed. Families had to make choices they never wanted to make. Move somewhere new, or wait until the government pushed them out. Some stayed as long as they could, hoping something would change. Others left early, knowing they had no power to stop any of it. The hardest part was the silence. There were no big public speeches, no community protests that made the news, no dramatic arguments with the government. It all happened quietly, almost politely. Letters were delivered. Properties were bought. Land was condemned. The town didn't fall in a single day. It slowly emptied itself of life. The school closed. The church closed. Houses stood empty. Businesses boarded their windows. Grass grew tall around the old rail line. By the time the bulldozers came, Livermore wasn't really a town anymore. It was a shell, a memory, a place with more empty houses than families, a valley, waiting for water. And that is how a living community became a name on a list. If stories like this matter to you, feel free to like and subscribe so moments like this aren't lost again. For decades, Livermore was erased on paper and erased in memory, until someone went looking. It didn't start with a big investigation or a historian carrying a camera crew. It started the way many rediscoveries do, with a simple moment of curiosity. A man walked along the edge of Conemaugh River Lake during an unusually dry summer. The water had dropped lower than normal, uncovering long stretches of the lake bed that people rarely saw. Most folks who visited the reservoir came for fishing or for the quiet, but this man noticed something odd sticking out of the mud. It wasn't shaped like a random rock. It wasn't smooth like driftwood. It had sharp lines, straight corners, the kind of structure that nature doesn't usually build by itself. When he got closer, he realized it looked like a piece of a stone foundation, the kind that holds up buildings, the kind that belongs to a place that once stood on dry land. He wasn't the first person to ever see something down there. Old-timers sometimes talked about strange shapes at the bottom of the lake, but this man didn't just look and walk away. He stopped. He thought about it, and then he started asking questions. What was this from? What building did it belong to? Why was it here in a lake that wasn't always a lake? He took a picture and showed it to a local history group. They knew a little bit about Livermore. The name came up sometimes in old stories or in papers saved in basements, but most people didn't know much more than it used to be a town. The man's photo made them curious too, so one of them, a local researcher, decided to go out and look at it herself. When she walked along the cracked mud and reached the spot, she saw even more than he had. She saw the old bridge abutments, the stone supports, that once held up the bridge that led into the town, and nearby she saw outlines on the ground, straight lines of rocks arranged too neatly to be natural. These were the foundations of old homes or stores. Further along she found long raised ground where the rail line had once run straight into Livermore. Piece by piece, the skeleton of the town appeared. It felt haunting, but not in a scary way, more in a quiet, respectful way, like being allowed to see something that had been hidden for a long time. Something that didn't want to shout, but wanted to be noticed. The researcher took notes and photos. When she returned home, she went looking for more information. She started at the small local libraries, flipping through shelves of county history books. She found mentions of Livermore as a canal town, a rail stop, a small community, but nothing explained why it disappeared. Nothing described the end of it. That silence bothered her. So she pushed further. She went to the county archives. She looked at old newspapers. She visited the historical society. Every place she went gave her a little piece of something, an article about a flood, a mention of land purchases, a short note about the new dam project, but the full story was not in one place. She met elderly residents who remembered hearing grown-ups talk about Livermore when they were young. Some said their parents used to drive past the town before it went underwater. Some remembered the old rail line. Some remembered when the government started buying land. Their memories were blurry but real. And then she found the documents that changed everything. Old government papers from the 1930s and 1940s. These were not easy to find. They were buried in folders, mixed with other flood control plans, full of formal language. But there they were. Pages showing condemnation orders. Pages showing property purchases. Pages describing the land the government needed for the future Conemaugh Dam and Reservoir. Livermore was not abandoned. Livermore was chosen. Not by the people who live there, but by the country that needed the valley to hold back floodwater. The papers explained that the town sat in the perfect spot for a reservoir pool. It was low in the valley, near the river bends, with enough open land to allow the water to spread during major storms. Engineers had drawn maps and circled the area. They had measured the water levels and written out plans. They had tested the soil and inspected the rail line and the old canal remnants. And in those same plans, they had listed every property that had to be taken. There were signatures. There were dates. There were amounts paid for land. Behind every line was a home, a yard, a memory, One document described the step-by-step demolition process the United States Army Corps of Engineers would follow: remove structures, clear debris, ensure no remaining building would become a hazard when the water rose. It was written in plain, calm government language, but the meaning was heavy. This town was deliberately erased. The researcher sat with those papers for a long time. She said later that the strangest part wasn't the destruction itself. It was how little had been recorded about the people. How few personal stories were written down. How the official papers talked about land, but not the lives lived on that land. She realized that Livermore wasn't forgotten because it was small. It was forgotten because the ending of the town was treated like a simple line item in a flood control project. And yet the pieces were there. Not loud, not flashy, but real. Foundations under the lake, old bridge supports, maps with pencil marks, letters about relocation, newspaper notes about the new dam project, memories carried by people who were children when the final families moved out. The truth rose the same way the foundations rose when the water got low, slowly, quietly, but clearly enough for anyone willing to look. Once the researcher began sharing the documents with the local history group, the story of Livermore began to take shape again, not as a ghost story, not as a myth, but as a real chapter of American life that had almost slipped out of sight. A whole town had been erased and barely documented. The truth was rising again piece by piece. Once those old papers and quiet memories began coming together, something changed in the valley. For the first time in many decades, people started talking about Livermore again. Not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way. It started the same way the discovery started: small, steady, and honest. Local historians took the documents the researcher found, along with photos of the exposed foundations, and began putting the story back together. They wrote articles for community newsletters. They shared pictures on small history forums. They added Livermore's story to local museum exhibits, not as a footnote, but as a full part of the region's history. One museum set up a simple display: a map of the old canal route, a photo of the surviving stone bridge abutments, a copy of a relocation notice from the 1940s, and a short paragraph about the St. Patrick's Day flood that set everything in motion. It wasn't a grand exhibit. It didn't need to be. People stood in front of it, reading each line slowly, trying to imagine the town that once filled the valley they now drove past without thinking. Then came the interviews. A local newspaper picked up the story and talked to older residents who remembered hearing their parents mention Livermore. The article wasn't long, but it was enough to stir curiosity. People who lived nearby started saying, "I never knew an entire town was under that water." Others said, "My grandparents talked about a place that disappeared. I didn't know this was the one." And with that, Livermore began to return, not physically, but in the minds and hearts of people who lived in the region. When hikers visited Conemaugh River Lake, they no longer saw just water. They started looking closer at the edges, hoping to catch a glimpse of the old stonework when the levels dropped. Some brought cameras. Some brought notebooks. Many simply brought a quiet sense of respect, wanting to understand what had been taken. Over time, Livermore gained a new kind of visibility. People began calling it one of Pennsylvania's notable ghost towns, not because it was haunted, but because its story lingered beneath the surface. Many ghost towns crumble in the open air. Livermore rested underwater, waiting to be remembered. Hikers shared photos of the old bridge supports on the internet. Kayakers pointed out places where the water seemed shallower, knowing the stones were just below. Families visiting the reservoir sometimes stopped on the trail and told their kids, "A whole town used to be right here." The children looked out over the water, eyes wide, trying to picture streets where fish now swam. Slowly, the silence that once surrounded the town began to break. Local groups worked together to place historical markers near the area. The signs told visitors about the canal era, the railroad years, the St. Patrick's Day flood, the dam project, and the relocation of the town. They were simple signs, but they gave Livermore its name back in a public place. The cemetery, which sat on higher ground and had never been flooded, also became a site of gentle care. Volunteers cleared brush, cleaned up old stones, and made sure the names carved there remained visible. Some visitors who had no family connection to the town still walked among the graves, feeling the weight of what had been lost. Digitally, Livermore began to appear in more places. Online archives added old photos and maps. Local history websites published timelines of the town. Some researchers uploaded scanned documents so anyone, anywhere could learn what happened. In a way, Livermore was lifted out of the water twice, once by the lowering of the lake, and again by the power of people choosing to remember. The emotional reaction across the community was mixed. Some people felt sadness, imagining the families who had to leave their homes behind. They thought about the school that would never ring its bell again, the church that stood silent, the streets that vanished underwater. The thought that ordinary, hard-working people lost their whole world because of a decision made far away sat heavy on the heart. But there was also gratitude. Gratitude that someone kept digging. Gratitude that the documents were found. Gratitude that younger generations were willing to listen. The people who lived in the valley now felt closer to the ones who lived there before them. They carried the story with them, even if they had no blood connection to the old town. What mattered was not whether they had ancestors in Livermore. What mattered was that they cared enough to say the town's name again. The recognition grew quietly but steadily. It did not explode into a national headline. Instead, it settled into the region's identity, the way small rivers carve their shapes over time. Firm, gentle, and lasting. Teachers in nearby schools began mentioning Livermore when teaching about the St. Patrick's Day flood, or about how dams changed American towns in the 20th century. Students sat in class and listened, surprised to learn that a place so close to home had been sacrificed in the name of protection. Some people took their families to the reservoir, just to stand near the water and imagine what used to be there. They pointed toward the middle of the lake and said, "That used to be Main Street." It felt unreal, almost like telling a child that a forest used to be a city. But it was true. And knowing the truth made the land feel different. The more people talked about Livermore, the more its story spread. It became a point of reflection, something that made visitors pause and think about the cost of progress, the cost of silence, and the cost of forgetting. And then, finally, something beautiful happened. Livermore's name became part of the living world again. Not underwater, not in hidden documents, not buried in a box, but spoken out loud. For a town that had its final days swallowed by silence, that simple act, speaking its name, was a kind of justice. A quiet, tender justice, but justice all the same. If this touched you, share it with someone. Stories like Livermore survive only when people choose to keep them alive. But the real meaning of Livermore isn't in the ruins, it's in what it teaches us today. When you look at the story from beginning to end, it becomes clear that Livermore is more than a place on an old map. It is a symbol of something bigger, something many people never think about until a story like this forces them to slow down and look deeper. Livermore shows us the price that small communities sometimes pay when the rest of the world is trying to solve a problem. Everyone needed protection from floods. Everyone wanted safety. But not everyone had to lose their home to get it. That is what makes Livermore's story feel heavy in the heart. It was not destroyed because people failed. It was not lost because it grew empty. It was taken away because someone far from the valley decided the land beneath those homes was needed for a greater good. And maybe that decision did protect many lives downstream. Maybe the dam truly kept people safe in later storms. But even when a decision is made for good reasons, it can still leave a wound behind. Livermore reminds us that safety can save lives, but it can also erase them. When we hear about the building of dams, bridges, and big public projects, we often focus on the benefits. We talk about the towns that were saved, the damage that was prevented, the progress that was made. But behind almost every major project in history, there are people whose lives were disrupted or changed forever. Livermore gives a face quiet and gentle to that truth. When you think about the families who once lived there, you start to understand something deeper. They didn't leave because they wanted a better opportunity somewhere else. They didn't sell their land because they were tired of the valley. They left because they were told they had to. And when the last family walked away, the town did not simply empty. It ended. That is why stories like this matter. Because every vanished town carries human stories that still matter. If no one remembers the people who lived there, it is almost like they disappear a second time. Livermore may be underwater, but the people who built that community were real. They worked hard. They cared for one another. They raised children. They lived honest lives. Those lives deserve to be recognized. They deserve to be spoken of with respect. And that is where the lesson reaches all of us today. America is still facing large changes. Climate change is bringing stronger storms. Some coastlines are shrinking. Some river towns still flood. Some communities will one day have to decide whether to move or to rebuild. As the land shifts, as weather grows more unpredictable, decisions like the one that destroyed Livermore might come again. And when they do, we must remember what happened here. Livermore teaches us that protecting people is important, but protecting memory is important too. If a town is lost, its stories must not be lost with it. If a community has to move, their history should come with them. If a valley is reshaped for safety, then the people who once lived there should not be erased from the story. Their names, their work, their daily lives, those things deserve a place in our shared memory. We cannot always stop storms. We cannot always control rivers, but we can choose to remember the people who lived beside them. That is why the rediscovery of Livermore was more than a historical project. It was an act of kindness toward the past. It showed that even if a place disappears, its meaning does not have to disappear with it. When you bring a story like this back into the light, you give dignity to the people who once lived it. In schools, when children learn about floods and dams, Livermore can be a reminder that progress has a cost. In families, when people visit the reservoir and see the still water, they can tell the next generation that a town once stood there. In history books, Livermore can hold a small but important place, a quiet lesson that even small communities matter in the grand story of a nation. And when someone stands at the edge of Conemaugh River Lake today, watching the sunlight move across the water, they can feel something deeper than silence. They can feel the presence of what once was. They may not see the streets or the homes. They may not hear the voices or the laughter. But knowing the story brings the place back to life in a small, powerful way. That is the gift Livermore leaves behind. A reminder. A warning. A voice rising through the still water. And in the end, when all the facts are understood and all the papers are read, the town leaves us with one peaceful truth. Places may disappear, but the people who live there leave echoes that time cannot drown. If stories like this help us remember who we are, you're welcome to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications to help keep these echoes alive. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.